Hello, everyone. My name is Hanbit Lee, and I'm so glad that you're here for today's webinar on bridging the gap, helping teens and parents thrive in bicultural families. Before we get started, I want to introduce Whitestone Counseling Resources, that we are a counseling ministry serving the local church with a distinctively Christian approach to professional counseling. And our mission is to help you find healing, build stronger relationships, and renew your faith. We have 25 counselors on staff and offer internship program for those with financial constraints. We also provide counseling in Spanish, Korean, and English to serve a wider community. If you feel counseling is the right step, you can visit our website and click Get Started or call us today. We also create free resources like this webinar to support the broader community because education and new perspectives are vital for growth. Thank you for joining me today, and I'm excited for what's ahead. And now I'd like to begin the webinar. I'm really excited about today's webinar as I'm working with teens, children, and parents. So we're going to learn more about how to bridge the gap between helping teens and parents who can thrive in biblical families. So my hope is to help the families thrive in communication and furthermore. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my hoped for outcomes and outline of what we're going to cover today in this webinar. So first, we will aim to understand what biculturalism is. There are different types of bicultural families that I'm going to address here. And we're going to understand what drives parenting tension. There are cultural mix-ups and clashes that are common in bicultural families. It can be shown as cultural, generational differences and tension, as well as values conflict. And we're going to learn about how do these impact teens' mental health. And lastly, we're going to learn simple, usable tools to listen better, speak clearly, and connect better at home. I'm also going to show you some biblical examples so that we can learn from the scripture. And we're also going to implement some practical communication strategies of how we can practice those at home. So, what is biculturalism? What does that even mean? Biculturalism is having comfort and proficiency with both heritage culture and the culture of the residing country. It is also about embedding both the culture of origin and culture in the receiving society, which means you might have Korean American or Indian American cultures at home. And it's also about speaking and embracing both languages, cultures of both backgrounds through media, through eating ethnic food, or practicing some ethnic or cultural rituals, etc., at home. Then we're going to learn more about the different types of bicultural families. There might be more than what I present here, but I would like to focus on these 4 different types of families. First is biracial family. Biracial family is a family where the parents or caregivers are from 2 different racial groups. There might be Caucasian, the mom would be a Caucasian, and the dad would be Asian American. And so they might be resulting in children who identify with or are identified as belonging to both racial groups. And the second is blended family. Blended family, as you might know, 2 different families living in one household through parents' remarriage, or the 2 different parents might have different relationships and they co-reside in one home. And therefore, family values may differ because they both from different cultural backgrounds, or they just might have different values or different, religion. Immigrant family is number 3, and they mainly come from a monoethnic family from their country of origin. Example would be a Korean married couple moved to the U.S. and raised children in the U.S. or it could be Chinese Americans or Chinese families that move from China to the US for educational purposes or for other purposes. And they have multicultural and multilingual individuals in one family because they immigrated to the States from their countries of origin. Lastly, there is adoption or foster family. They have mixed race or mono race adoptions or foster care families. They also tend to be more monocultural than other family types because they tend to have or practice mainstream culture, which is American culture. The parents are the caretakers who educate and cultivate that culture to the kids. So, what does it look like to be living in a bicultural home? Bicultural homes may practice both heritage and receiving cultures. So, someone might eat pizza with a Korean soda if you're a Korean American family, or if you are Latino family, you might mix Spanish words and English, or your teens might have mixed ethnic friend groups, such as Japanese Americans, Americans, and Japanese friends, in case if you are Japanese American households. And one example might be this a person named Jenny grew up in a Korean American home where she watched K-pop Demon Hunters with her friends while her parents were preparing Lunar New Year's Day tradition. So you can see different cultures are practiced in one household. So living in and holding both culture as individuals can also lead to certain characteristics and challenges, and we'll be learning more about in the next slide. What drives tension between parents and teens? So these are some of the cultural mix-ups and clashes that we will learn further about. The cultural tension exists between the first and second generations. I'm going to apply viewpoints as immigrants versus US borns, which is first generations as those who immigrate from different countries, and the second generations, they born here in the United States. And we're also going to cover what values might conflict in the different families. The first one that I like to introduce is called me versus we cultures. So, me culture is individualistic and more self centered, though not always selfish. But we culture, however, is more collectivistic. They more focus on the communities that they belong to or the families or the societal aspect is more important than the individual cultures. So individualistic represents the me culture. It emphasizes on independence, self-reliance, and personal achievements, while the collectivistic culture focuses more on the we culture. They again focus on the community, selflessness, and group achievements. And how do these can potentially cause cultural tension and expectations? We're gonna see, yeah, what those tension and expectations can look like. So, traditional second generation immigrant children, let's say your parents are from Mexico, but you were born here in the US, therefore you're Mexican American. They often take on cultural vocal roles, being a translator, mediator, etc. Your parents, you might have an experience where your parents, if you're immigrated households, that they might take you to grocery shops and they ask you what these products mean in Mexican, or if they have to sign a lease for their vehicles or for their homes, they might take you there to receive some help from you as you being the translator or maybe even a mediator between two different individuals or more. So for that reason, the children learn and speak a language fluently because they were raised here in the United States, speaking English at school and with their friends, or maybe at church as well. And this dynamic can lead to the role confusion or role reversal within the family because oftentimes the children give the care or they provide the transition, they provide the mediation, where often is presented by the parents and not necessarily always the children if you're not a bilingual or a bicultural family. However, there's untraditional second generation, which is a more recent trend that emerges. And in this case, the parents are often well educated and are fluent in English. They might have completed higher education in the States, or they settled down in the States after their graduation from English speaking countries or environment. And they might have moved from other countries as expats with strong English speaking backgrounds. And so in this case, it reduces the language barrier and encourages more frequent communication in English between parents and children. So in bicultural families, this is what your children might experience. Children of immigrant parents are often perceived as foreigners, even though they're born and raised here in the United States as second generations, because they're not always received as the nationals or someone who were born here as the majority because they don't look like, or they think that they don't look like the nationals here for cultural reasons, or for what they eat, or for the words that they speak. So, because of that, it can lead to identity confusion for teens. So, now let us look into the values conflict between parents and teens, especially in terms of the communication or how they adapt to the society, and also media use. So parents use media a little less frequently and more selectively than the teens, where teens they have high influence by media through TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, etc. Use media a little bit more frequently than the parents, and maybe a little bit more selectively as well. And also in terms of the values, they value success and security, while teens highly value emotions and relationships. And the parents tend to be less enculturated, while teens be more enculturated and maybe even acculturated, feeling highly belong to the society that they're in right now. And parents have more values and cultures of origin, while the teens have values in the mainstream culture, what they see in the media, or what their friends might do. So one thing that we might have noticed up until this point is that there's a shared concern, which is feeling misunderstood. The parents feel misunderstood because they have a different cultural and personal values than what the teens have. And both sides feel probably unseen or probably unheard because they don't share the exact same cultural values. So, how does biculturalism impact teens' mental health? We're going to look at some statistics here. Studies show that 18.6% of Asian American teens have major depressive disorder, and then 25% of Latinx American teens experience depression. 25% of overall immigrant children experience depressive and anxiety symptoms, and 25% of biracial American teens experience mental health concerns. And so, as you can see from this data, it proves the importance of paying attention to children's mental health because the more likely that you are a bicultural families, yeah, and then the more that you might experience some mental health concerns. So, surprisingly, I don't know if you're familiar with this data or not, but 65% of individuals from bicultural families experience identity related crisis. Again, there might be role confusion or role reversals, or there might be other tensions or misunderstandings or conflicts that all bicultural families experience in many different ways. Now, we're going to look into some biblical examples of bicultural family. There are many bicultural families examples shown in the Pentateuch, but we're going to look into the examples of Israelites in Moses' generation and Joshua's generation. So the context that you might be familiar with this already, but Moses and their sons were living in Egypt, and they were laboring and trying to get out of the Egypt through Exodus. And so think of this situation as Moses being the leading generation of the Israelites, which is them being the first generation, and Joshua as the following generation being the second generation. And there are bicultural differences embedded in the biblical narrative of the Pentateuch. So Moses' generation, when Moses was a leader of the Israelites, some people were born in Israel or some people were born in Egypt, but most of them are laboring in Egypt as slaves. And this generation went through Exodus, wilderness, and the process of establishing the laws as the leading generation of the Exodus. Meanwhile, Joshua's generation was a leader of, when the Joshua was the leader of the Israelites, they were born in the wilderness. And this is the generation that went through the wilderness and finally stepped into the promised land. And as you might be familiar, they share the same journey of wilderness, although it might look different because Moses' generations were the parents' generation or the leading generation that were more actively involved in the process or living in the wilderness, while Joshua's generation is probably a younger generation, so they went through that wilderness process in a different way. And so here we're going to look into intergenerational shifts, cultural adaptation, and identity formation between the two different generations and how they're actually formed through that exodus or wilderness process. So let's look into the Moses generation first. They tend to hold on to the past. They often wanted to go back to Egypt because that's where their familiarity is derived from. They might say, at least we had food in Egypt, complaining about the lack of resources, the lack of food in the wilderness after Exodus. And they also had the fear of the new world. They were not prepared to inhabit Canaan. They distrusted God and Moses. They often, again, complained. Um, and they also had cultural insecurity and complaint. They might have experienced identity crisis, and that's why they decided to worship idol and make it. And they also had tribal grumbling as well through that process. And the Moses generation represented the first generation immigrants who moved from Egypt to the wilderness and eventually to the promised land in Canaan. They also deeply hold to the old world values. They're accustomed to what they practice in Egypt, or maybe even before that. So they feel caught between preservation of tradition and fear of change. They're emotionally tied to the origins um, and less to fully adapt to the new cultural values. And so, as you can see, they're not ready yet to receive the new culture and to conquer the promised land. And that's why the Joshua is succeeding that mission as a second generation. They represent second generation children who grow up in a hybrid space, physically and mentally. They must interpret, navigate, and integrate two sets of values. They were often asked to take on leadership and adapt quicker than their parents. And these are what we've already covered in our previous slides, that they are often asked to take leadership because they hold a little bit more tighter to the new cultures and new customs than the first generations. And so they are tasked with building something new, rooted in the past, but relevant to the present. Again, they are more adaptable and more used to navigate the new situations or new cultures, new atmospheres than the leading generations of Moses. In their story, we see a biblical parallel to what many bicultural families go through today. So Moses' generation left Egypt and they struggled to adapt, and they missed the old ways and feared the new world. However, Joshua's generation, born in the wilderness, had to fight to build a new home and identity in Canaan. So they really cultivated and fought for their new home and identity in Canaan. So parents in bicultural homes often carry the weight of the past, just like how the Israelites did, the sacrifices, the language, and the customs, while teens, as Joshua's generation, are trying to lead in a new world that feels new, fast paced, and maybe often even confusing. So, like Joshua, today's teens aren't rejecting the past. They are being called to bridge it with the present, even though there are challenges and difficulties. Now, I would like to equip you guys with some practical tools that you can take to home and practice together with your children and this family as whole. So, moving towards togetherness, what do we share in common? This is the first question that you might want to ask yourself and to your families to bring more togetherness. So, first strategy would be find something that all family members can share. What games or activities bring us together? Can we play Uno together? Can we go on a picnic that we all like? And what values do we have in common? We value integrity and we have faith that we all share as family. And what's one dinner menu that we all like as family members that we can all share and that we can all enjoy at the same time? And then the second would be providing mental health resources and support to yourselves and also to your families. It can be through books, support groups, and also individual or family therapy. These are great resources to help equip the next generation, as well as looking after yourself. When communicate at home, use I statements and not use statement. For example, I think it is X, Y, and Z, or I feel X, Y, and Z, versus saying you did X, Y, and Z, or you said X, Y, and Z. So this is a gentle way of communication rather than sharp or you oriented communication style. And also, when you communicate, try to establish flexible expectations and not fixed expectations. Even if your teams do not succeed in the areas that you want them to succeed, try to see the areas that they are already succeeding. Would it be about sports? Would it be about their hobbies that they're thriving in already? And then ask for forgiveness and forgive one another. You can always say, I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, or I'm sorry that I didn't see you where you are. And also be able to forgive one another in that manner. And lastly, bless one another through discovering you and your teen's love language. Is your are your teens into watching movies, or do they like certain food, or do they like to do certain activities? How about spending time together and doing those activities together? In that way, you are blessing them. So these are some of the resources that I found would be helpful for you guys. The first book is called The Whole Brain Child. It is a nurturing strategies to understand more of your children. Why do they think the way that they think? Or why do they behave the way that they behave? And then the second book is a novel. It's called The Book of Unknown Americans. That explains more about the bicultural family households and what they look like and what they experience and how your children actually discovers the differences between the American cultures, their culture, their parents' cultures of origin, and how that mix or how that might look like at your own home. So these are some of the reflection questions and takeaways that you can ask yourself what you have learned from today's webinar and what you can also ask with your children's to yourselves. So first would be, what do I want to try differently this time as I've learned some new information and some new strategies? And then what's one thing I now understand about my parents or my teens that I didn't get to know before? And where do we already have a bridge? You might already share a lot of common values or uh, maybe faith or maybe something else. And what makes our family unique and how we combine cultures or experiences? And how do we talk about differences in our home, whether cultural, emotional, or personal? And lastly, what values bring us together, even if we come from different starting points? Again, these are helpful questions to reflect on and ask yourselves. So, yeah, that's all for today. And thank you again so much for joining this webinar. I hope this provided some helpful strategies and information that help you equipped more to communicate more effectively, better with your children, better with your families at home. Yeah, my hope for you is to be able to communicate and be able to see each other in a more thoughtful and warm way. So thank you again for joining today. And I look forward to seeing you guys in my next webinar, or maybe I'll see you in person. So thank you.